thank you for joining everyone. I'm going to make a start now. So welcome everyone to this webinar, Sustainable Demolition in the Circular Economy. Today we're delighted to be joined by IES member Jess Shaw. Jess is Principal Consultant and a Chartered Environmentalist with 8 years experience in the environment industry, including waste management, site investigation and monitoring, and remediation. Jess has spent the last 4 years working on and managing demolition projects with industrial clients and local authorities. Today's webinar will focus on the driving forces and needs behind the shift from a linear to circular economy, how this can be achieved, and the future of the demolition and end-of-life asset industry. As always, there will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these at the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. As usual, this event is being recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jess. I'll now hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for the introductions as well. So I had added a slide about it, but I won't go into any more detail about me. Just adding around sort of my experience in the demolition industry. I started working with our demolition team about 4 years ago now, and essentially just discovered how much I enjoyed it and how passionate I was about demolition, and how we're starting to see a shift in the demolition industry now around the sort of sustainability of demolition, hence why I'm here today, and just like to share with you some of the work that I'm doing at the moment and as a team we're doing at the moment to try and improve sustainability within the industry. So I will run through the evolution of D6. I'll tell you a bit about what that means, where that's come from and where we are today. And then I'll talk to you about the approach to sustainable demolition, and then just also introduce a case study for something that we've done recently, and then highlight over some future trends. Okay, so a bit of a background on D6 or D4. So D4 is what it used to be known as, and what other people might know it as in the sector. And D4, essentially it's 4 Ds, stands for deactivation, decommissioning, decontamination and demolition. So deactivation is essentially just closure of a site, isolating it, mothballing. Decommissioning involves draining of plant and equipment. Decontamination, removing of hazardous materials and making the site safe. And demolition, what it is, but often closely followed by waste removal and potentially remediation as well, depending on what the site is. Demolition has always been quite a reactive industry, so it could be structural issues, redevelopment, but generally we find that there's often not a lot of time for planning and preparation, and demolition is far less thought about than construction, and often it's almost a solution to a problem. And essentially clients just want the site to be demolished and things done as quickly and as safely as possible. So that's led to quite a linear economy. So the D4 we would class as a linear process, essentially meaning that materials, outputs from the site become waste. This often goes for recycling, so we are better at that now, but still materials are generally become waste at the end of the project. As I mentioned, in some cases demolition may be followed by remediation work, and essentially clients often just want to be rid of the hazards as fast as possible, which is what we find a lot. We get a lot of clients asking for a fully remediated site regardless of the cost or the impact, and often it depends on what the contamination is, but that often is sort of excavation and disposal essentially. And as I touched on, linear approach, the life of a built asset at the moment is very much extract, make, construct it, operate it until a point when it's no longer required, and then demolish it and then dispose of the material at the end. So I guess is demolition better than remediation? Retention? It's a bit of an ethical dilemma. I think there's a couple of good examples here. Launceston Primary School is being demolished because of construction issues. But we often find that actually in some cases, and probably more often than not, they're perhaps being demolished for maybe more superficial requirements. So for example, a Lidl site in Dorset have been given permission to demolish their old store because it's described as dated and it can't meet the needs of the customers and their shopping environment and what they expect. So I think when you break that down, it's trying to understand what that actually means, and is it really a genuine requirement? So Lidl say that they are looking to install a more sustainable building, reduced energy and water consumption, solar panels, electric car charging points, which are all really, really great things, and I think should be thought about and should be introduced into new buildings. However, is the benefit of bringing those in, how does that compare with the impact of taking it down in the first place? And I think that that's not always considered. I think nowadays the longevity of a building isn't really considered. We find that a lot of clients are taking buildings down not long after they've been put up. We've actually got one where it's being torn down 8 years after it was built. I think it needs change, especially since the pandemic. We've seen quite a big shift in demand of what our clients want. So we've got a site at the moment, for example, where they have a big drive for net zero sustainable office spaces. Obviously that requires the demolition of old buildings, and I think what we're trying to understand is that it's great that people want these sustainable spaces and their buildings to be better quality, but actually what is the environmental impact of taking those old structures down? And if they do absolutely need to come down, is there a way that we can do it better? And so it has less of an impact on the environment. And a couple of articles, I think, demonstrate that it's going to become a bigger issue over the future. More and more architects, local authorities are thinking about this and are being urged not to knock things down. So I think now's the time to change and start looking at ways that we can essentially meet our needs of the future, but without compromising our future generations. So I think, again, another good example you may have heard of or may be aware of what's going on in the media. Oxford Street in London, the old M&S building, is currently going through lots of levels of public inquiry. They want to demolish it to create a brand new store. Again, another sustainable, efficient, better quality building. But there, obviously, it's being contested. People don't want the new structure. And they don't want the demolition of the old building because it's quite a nice building, but the reason that they're using is essentially the sustainable impact, the impact on the environment. And London and a lot of cities have got net zero targets that they are probably not going to meet, and obviously demolition of buildings like this are only going to make that worse. So I think as well, at the moment in the demolition sector, I feel we very much look at the least bad option. So currently, sustainability in the demolition sector is very much, high recycling rates, alternative fuel sources. And if you look at any contractor's tender submission bid, if you ask them to tell you about sustainability in that, they will all have the same generic answers of, we have 95% plus recycling rates, all our plant is electric, we use HVO fuels. And I can bet pretty much every single contractor has the same response. And that again has a big impact on the outcome of the project. So the London 2012 Olympic Park site, which was a 2.5 square kilometre site in East London. So they obviously needed to demolish a number of buildings to make way for the new development. So they actually implemented a sustainable development strategy to help that, which set target recycling rates of 90%, which is great. It sounds great. However, that was a combined target of 90% reuse and recycling. And then when the project was completed, and the demolition contractors presented their actual metrics of what was recycled and what was reused, it was found that actually the rate was 90% recycling and more like 0% reuse. And that's part of the problem, is at the moment there's no split out approach to looking at them separately, and recycling is very much the least bad option, and we should always be looking at ways that we can repurpose and reuse materials beforehand, but ultimately it costs, and I think that's the problem that we're seeing for clients and contractors. They just want to remove the building, they want to get rid of the waste for the least cost and the quickest and safest way possible. So why are the change? And I think these are some quite stark reminders of the impact the construction and demolition industry has. So when you look at these, you can understand a bit more about the perspective of where we're coming from. So the construction and demolition sectors of 2016 was responsible for 62% of the total waste generated, which is absolutely huge. And the built environment uses almost half of the world's materials extracted each year. And I think the problem that we're having is that there's a lack of good quality information, lack of accurate information. People don't understand what their buildings are constructed of, and what they can do with the materials after. Lack of engagement and collaboration between all the parties. Demolition contractors and us as a team are generally brought in towards the end, and again when it's quite a reactive response needed. So there really isn't much time for coordinated planning, and to provide, you know, good evaluations and good assessments of what actually we can do with those materials. So today, you know, a lot of the focus on built environment has been improving the efficiency of new buildings. As I mentioned, you know, a lot of clients are looking for sustainable buildings, sustainable offices, and the decarbonisation pathways have been very much kind of reliant on the use of alternative fuels and carbon offsetting, which personally I think is just putting a band-aid over the problem. You know, it's, you know, obviously we should be doing what we can, but I don't think it's enough. I think as well there isn't enough reliance on alternative pathways, so considering embodied carbon emissions, which is often 20 to 40% of the whole life carbon emissions of a new building. So I think what we need to do, I think we need to be looking at the whole process. So, you know, new buildings, you know, sustainability of new buildings is really, really important, but how are those made and what are the materials that we're using to make those? Where are they coming from? And are we just constantly extracting new raw materials for that? So the graph on the right hand side essentially has come from the research from the Centre of Industrial Energy, and essentially they are reporting that improving material use could potentially reduce emissions by nearly 200 meters of carbon dioxide by 2032. So essentially that's split across 5 different sectors, so vehicles, food and drink, electronics and appliances, and clothing and textiles. And then construction industry, sorry, is the 5th one, but actually construction industry equates to 50% of that, which is enormous. So it just demonstrates the impact that the construction industry could have on reducing carbon. And then just a very quick slide of showing some of the examples of CO2 in building materials. So essentially we look at these values and take them to do assessments when we're looking at demolition of buildings, which I'll touch on in a little while. So that is essentially how we've got to D6. So D6 is the circular approach, essentially. So it's the addition of 2 new Ds, design and distribution, to close that circle. And on the right-hand side, this is the butterfly model taken from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is a really interesting picture. So the industry that we're looking at is the one on the right-hand side, which is the technology industry and the technical cycle, essentially. So essentially looking at how materials are kept in circulation through processes of reuse and repair and manufacture and recycling. And what we should be aiming to do is work from the inner circle out, with recycling being the very last option in the chain. So how we go about doing that, just to give a bit more information on each of those Ds and what they now mean. So obviously D1 is design, and that's where we come in at the earlier stages of the project. We're engaging with clients, with designers and planners to essentially see how we can support adopting those circular design principles in new buildings, but also where we come to the end of life of a project, we want to engage with clients a lot earlier to help them make good assessments of what their building could be either used for or where the material could go, so that they actually have a solution that's backed up by science, rather than just going, oh, well, we'll just, you know, send it off for recycling and that's great. So deactivation of facilities. So previously where that was sort of removal of plant and equipment, and it still is, but rather than just sending it off recycling as it often would do, it's looking at alternative ways that those materials could be repurposed. So potentially could they go off for auction, or could they be used in another site elsewhere? Charities we find often take equipment depending on what the site is. And then so that's, yeah, deactivation and decommissioning, decontamination. So obviously continued removing of all the sort of contaminants. Then dismantling. So that's, I think, the main change in this is the demolition is not a thing now as part of this approach, and actually it's dismantlement. And it's taken down in such a way that allows those materials to then be reused elsewhere. So, for example, if you've got a brick building, rather than just using a machine to go in and knock the building down, which then means you've just got a pile of rubble at the end, somebody actually goes in and deconstructs the building so you can reuse the bricks from it in a new building. So again, there's sort of the more to sort of think around that, which I'll talk about soon, but that's the general approach. And then the last D, which is again new, is distribution. So redeployment and redistribution of those materials back into the supply chain. So either as individual materials, or we've even seen it, you know, before, where companies, you know, say you've got a metal structure, it could even be picked up and moved elsewhere and used as a new facility on a new site. So how are we approaching this? So I guess the main one, starting with the design stage, is waste and carbon audits. So I think the COVID pandemic has very clearly exposed issues of the linear economy, with like shortage of materials, brick, steel. We know how hard it was to source certain things during the pandemic, which is in some cases still the case. And that then obviously leads to increasing prices. So I think we need to start viewing buildings as material banks instead. And there's another number of ways that you can do this. So you can look at it through design of redundant asset decommissioning. So that is what we would call retirement asset planning. So looking at a structure and understanding what material you have there and what is the embodied carbon of all those buildings. And if you plan in advance how you can then design the most sustainable approach to demolishing that building, which is backed up by actual science. And then also looking at the sort of new normal of modern buildings as well. So planning for retirement. We know that longevity of buildings is just not really considered anymore. Needs change over time, need for different areas, different buildings. And so if that's the case, then we should be looking at how structures are built in such a way to allow them to be taken down, to be able to repurpose those materials in future, if that's what the new normal is. And we do this through starting off with a number of surveys, so measured building surveys, allowing us to accurately quantify materials that are likely to be generated, estimate of embodied carbon in those materials, identification of potential reuse options. So again, auctions, sister sites that the company might have, and then quantification with opportunities available in the overall project. So if you have a client who is going to demolish their site and then redevelop it themselves, is there a way that those materials from that demolition could then be integrated within that new redevelopment as well? So I think, as always, digital innovation technology is always the way forward. So we are working on a number of building surveys at the moment, so internal buildings to look at the internals of a structure, but also getting good quality drone models to allow us to actually accurately measure structures. Previously, it would be done by demolition contractors or a surveyor potentially going out and just doing the visual assessment. And I think that's part of the problem, is that at the moment people don't have enough good quality information about their building and what actually it holds and it stores. Whereas being able to carry out specific surveys will allow us to give much more confidence in the data and the amount of materials there. And below is an example of a carbon assessment, so showing 3 different routes with the outcome of materials. So you can see, obviously, with the disposal route, you essentially lose all of your embodied carbon. If you recycle it, you retain a portion of it, but you still lose some of it. But reuse, you will obviously then retain the entire amount of your embodied carbon. And that's what the assessments aim to do, is so then you can then make a decision on what you want to do with that structure. And then there's also other factors that you need to take into consideration as well, because obviously retaining a material as it is great, but obviously it depends on the impact of the wider project. So that kind of leads us on to the decision. So deconstruction or demolition. I think deconstruction, on the face of it, seems like the most sustainable option, but actually there are cases where it's not. So for example, you know, the extent of the site, the size, the program, number of resources might need to be considered. Are there any remediation works that are needed at the end? Because obviously deconstruction is slower, and you'll obviously then have a prolonged time on site. So there will be obviously additional resources, additional welfare time. So you need to consider the impact of that. So basically, I think what we're saying is that it's not one size fits all, and it's not a yes, every single building should just be deconstructed, but there needs to be some kind of thought out approach to it and thought out process to allow people to make accurate and good quality decisions. I think a good example is the use of bricks. So we had a site recently where the redeveloper wanted to reuse the bricks, which again, great, love to do. However, because so there would have obviously been the initial additional energy consumption due to more time and labor on site. So that's one thing you have to take into consideration. However, and on this site, the potential recovery rate of the bricks was only about 20%, and that was because of the way the building was built. and actually that there was a very good chance that as you took that building down, you might lose the other 80% because they might get damaged. You then couldn't use them in the new design, because in the new scheme, because they weren't structurally sound. So then on top of that, you've also got then the impact of transporting the bricks off site. So if you take all of those off site, that's a number of vehicle movements. And then on this site, we actually ended up having quite a few excavations to backfill. So we would have then had to import a lot of material back in to site to fill those excavations. So in the end, we made the decision that actually the most sustainable option was purely to crush the bricks and use it as backfill. But again, it's that a sort of a process to reviewing that, and there was quite a lot of research that went into the process of recovering bricks and how that would look, so we could make that decision backed up by some evidence. So just talk to you about a case study of another project that I worked on about 2 years ago now, which was a precious metals refinery in London. So it was built in 1924, and it was essentially closed down in 2018, and then in 2021 it was sold to a new development company. So it was sold beforehand, and then development was going to commence in 2021. So we needed to decontaminate the building, decommission, demolish and remediate. So because it was a precious metal refinery, so those 8 metals that are shown in the screen there, they provided quite a lot of risk to the site from a health point of view. So the primary driver on this project ultimately was health and safety. And the client was very, very concerned around the PGM dust. So PGM dust has it's essentially, it could cause people to become sensitized, it can lead to cancer, it can have lots of other harmful impacts on people. So they were very worried about this building being taken down and then potentially dust being released and then causing health impacts for people in the local community, the construction workers on site. So one of the ways to deal with it is just by potentially taking the material and disposing it at landfill. What we did instead is we actually worked with a company who are based in the UK who recover metals through thermal treatment. So this is where it comes into the design stage. So we actually undertook a lot of investigation on the site. We introduced something called an XRF, which essentially you can use to screen materials. And it gives you a value of how much PGM is in that material. So we did that on soil, we did it on concrete, building fabric, all the historical equipment as well. And we then mapped that out to have a look at where all the hotspot areas were around the site. So the map that you can see on the bottom essentially is PGM concentrations in tiles and grout. And as you can see where obviously the red spots are, there are higher concentrations of PGMs in those areas. So that allowed us to undertake a bit of a recovery assessment. So we obviously had quite a lot of concentrations of metals in there in some areas. So we decided to actually send that off for recovery. So the process kind of followed with decontamination of the plant and equipment. We then washed down sort of former tank farms, also the residues on buildings. So we found that there was quite a lot of dust sitting on the tiles. And we were able to collect those residues through the effluent. So it would filter out the PGMs, and we would collect PGMs, and then they could be sent off for recovery as well. And then we also then were able to do an early hotspot removal. So we went round and essentially pulled up areas of tiles, pulled up areas of grout and concrete and soil where we thought there was high levels of concentrations of platinum metals, and we sent that off for recovery. And then it came to the deconstruction of the plant. So I mentioned previously around auctions. So the site we facilitated them doing a big auction. So we had plant that went off to their sister site. but we also sold quite a few bits of equipment to other companies. You can see from the picture on the left hand side, this is actually one of the furnaces being removed to be taken off elsewhere. So that meant quite a significant amount of material then wasn't going to landfill or going for recycling. On this project specifically, we didn't deconstruct the building for a number of reasons. So the scale of the site was enormous, and that would have just led to a hugely prolonged program. And there were a lot of people on site. There were a lot of welfare buildings just to meet the needs of the project. So that would have had a huge impact from energy usage point of view. We also had significant quantities of material. So all those materials that if we'd have deconstructed, we would have then had to import through London through significant truckloads. On this one, again, we had a lot of excavations on site. So we had to undertake a massive remediation program. So if we'd have deconstructed the building and the material had then been taken off site to go to a reclamation yard or for use elsewhere, we would have then had to have imported huge amounts of material to then bring back in to the site to backfill excavations with. So a bit of a calculation, we had around 3,854 meters cubed of backfill material that we put back into excavations. That is around 462 lorry loads, to give a bit of context to it. So if we'd have had to have imported more fill to do that, you could imagine the amount of lorry loads driving through central London to do that. So instead what we did, and again, understanding through a sort of a sustainable options appraisal, that actually the best solution on this was to crush the material from the buildings, the concrete, the brick, and reuse it as backfill. And so, yeah, so that was essentially the most sustainable option for that project. Again, I think where possible, you should recover certain bits, whether it's plant, equipment. I think, it depends on where it's going and what it's being used for. So it has to have that bit of an options appraisal to see what is the right thing to do. But outcome of this project, we essentially had, we managed to avoid huge amounts of waste going off site. We were able to reuse a lot. We also were able to auction off, donate a lot of the former assets from the site. Industrial furniture that got taken off elsewhere. Recycling, we ended up recycling quite a lot of other material. So where equipment was washed down and decontaminated appropriately, didn't need to be recovered because there wasn't anything on it, that could then be recycled rather than sent off for landfill. And then the recovery aspect of all the platinum metals equated to around 4,000 kilos of PGM. So again, metals metal mining has a huge impact on the environment. So being able to reuse those metals and put those metals back into the economy is fantastic. So so a really kind of good all-round outcome for that. For how we tackled sustainability on that project. And I think the outcome, what I've said hopefully throughout the presentation, is, as I said, not one size fits all. So it's having a good options appraisal backed by science that we can help our clients make those good decisions. So just lastly, a couple of bits on future trends. So I think just the way that we see things are going at the moment. So I think there's going to be a lot more influence on new waste markets. So waste streams, but opportunities for companies to distribute their materials that have come off their facilities. So things like reclamation yards and things like that, I think will start to become more of a a thing in the construction industry. Increased digitalization. So we talked about the building surveys and how those can help make those decisions. And a lot of it is about having good quality data, which a lot of our clients don't have at the moment. So being able to use digital tools to give them that allows us to make better decisions. And then lastly, again, electrification of plant and alternative fuels. We're starting to see a lot more of this now. I think they tend to use it where they can, but obviously it depends on availability of sources in the area, depends on where the project is and various other aspects. But we're starting to see a lot more focus on use of different fuels and electric plant and equipment nowadays, and automation of plant as well, because I think one of the things that with deconstruction of a building, it's not always the safest way to go about it, because it depends on how it's done. Often includes things like encapsulation of a building, where you've got people working on top of a structure, which is not necessarily the safest way to go about it. So if there's a way that we can create plant that almost takes the element of people working away from it, it obviously makes it a lot safer. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jess, for that presentation. It was so interesting to hear about how circular economy can be embedded within the demolition or deconstruction process. So thank you for that. To all our attendees, please do put any questions that you have for Jess in the Q&A function, and we'll get on to these now. So just to kick us off, it was really interesting to hear about the kind of D6 process. And obviously the first part of that, the design part, involves engagement with stakeholders. In your experience, how open have stakeholders been to the D6 process?
So I think it depends on who you're working with, and I think it depends on who the client is, because I find that we find that industrial clients tend to be a bit more aware of their responsibilities around sustainability. We also, because I work in the remediation and contaminated land team, they're also very aware of their sort of below ground hazards. So they're more receptive to assessment of their above ground structures as well. It's still a bit of a challenge, because I think ultimately cost comes into it quite significantly. And at the moment, I think clients are still, especially local authorities are probably a good example of where perhaps they don't have huge amounts of money, and ultimately deconstruction is a more costly process. So I think in that sense, they're not quite as receptive. I think part of the problem is at the moment, as I said before, it's a very reactive industry, and we only seem to get brought in when it's urgent. So then when you're trying to implement those design stages, it's almost too late to do that, because they are essentially needing something done yesterday. I think it depends on how early you can get in with it. But yeah, we tend to find our more industrial clients are perhaps a bit more receptive to those conversations. But hopefully, I think what we're aiming for is that we can start working with some of our other clients to again see where they've got facilities, so they've got assets that perhaps are just sitting there, and almost plan for that perhaps even years in advance, and say, yes, we know you're not looking at that right now, but let us do an assessment of the building and help you understand what materials you've got there, and almost looking at them as material banks instead.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Jess. And we've got a question here from an attendee. It might be a bit broad, but it says, could you advise how you would approach the deconstruction or demolition of a gasworks for redevelopment in the most sustainable way? And maybe a way to approach this is going into a bit more detail about the options appraisal process and how you go about that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a difficult question, because again, it very much depends on what the gasworks, I guess, are constructed of, whether it's concrete, is it metal? I don't know. I'm not particularly an expert on what gasworks are constructed of. But again, like you say, that option appraisal stage would help you to do that. So essentially what we would look at is coming in and doing that pre-demolition audit and that pre-demolition assessment, scanning the building, doing an internal survey and understanding what materials you've got there. I think concrete is generally a little bit of a more tricky one to deconstruct just because of the nature of it. If it's metal and you've got, you know, I don't know, steel in the building, or, you know, again, that's probably a bit easier to take down. So I guess it really depends on what comes out of that initial options appraisal, and what comes out of that assessment of what materials are there.
Great, thank you. And kind of drawing on some of the things you mentioned in your presentation, in particular, you mentioned just then about the industry being quite reactive, and you've drawn some parallels between planning and the demolition process. Obviously, for planning, EIA is a key part of the process, environmental impact assessment. So do you think there needs to be a similar process legislated for demolition to ensure that, that the impacts are limited from this process?
Certainly, yeah, absolutely, there does. At the moment, there's virtually no legislation in place. We're starting to see some filter through in, say, London. I think, again, I can't remember exactly what the name of the legislation is off the top of my head, but there is some regulations around sustainability assessments in central London. But again, it's only certain areas, certain buildings of a certain size. And as I say, London only. Apart from that, there's virtually nothing. And I think very much so it should be integrated within the planning process. At the moment, demolition is actually quite easy to, you can demolish a building mostly by permitted development, so something we call a prior notification for demolition. It's a very easy process to go through, and it requires virtually no or to very little planning in place to be able to get that approved. The exceptions being a pub and a wine bar, oddly, because they are sociable community environments. So I think, yes, there should be more influence on planning and legislation to force people to look at it, force clients to look at it when they're demolishing a building, and make it harder for them to take the easy, cheap, unenvironmentally friendly way out.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense. And we've got time to squeeze just one more question in, I think. So we've got an attendee here saying that they're involved in producing circular economy statements for the GLA, and they're finding that clients are very rarely carrying out compliant pre-refurbishment and pre-demolition audits in good time to provide as inputs to planning applications. Are you personally seeing more appointments for this sort of work and in good time to feed into that planning process?
We're not, again, there's not any legislation at the moment around pre-demolition audits. There are in other countries, so France, I think, are pretty good at it, Germany, some of the other countries in Europe, but in the UK, there is no legislation really around pre-demolition audits at the moment. So clients essentially don't need to do it. So we get very little requests to come and actually physically just do a standalone demolition audit, and most of our work tends to be clients that we're working with already, that we can almost outline the benefits to them. So yeah, again, similar to the question before about planning, I think there needs to be more regulation around that. Right.
Well, thank you so much, Jess, for joining us today. It was a really interesting presentation, and thank you for answering our questions as well. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, and thank you to everyone who attended. I hope you found that as beneficial and informative as I did.